Back, everyone. You can find your seats, and we'll get started. Awesome. So I'd like to introduce you to Raf and Lance. They're here from the Developer Institute. They're going to give you a talk entitled Turn Around the Lives Through Teaching. And the Developer Institute helps grow and teach new people to become developers and helps them expand their horizons and get into our community. So give a big round of applause to Lance and Raf.
Thank you. Cheers. Okay, so we're going to be talking, as was mentioned, about how Developers Institute and all of you can change the development community by bringing new people in, by growing juniors. I've been a tech lead and I've hired, and often the tendency tends to be towards seniors. And we're going to look at the skills and capabilities we need to grow others and bring them in on this journey. Now, Developers Institute is hiring, so I'm going to leave that up there just for a second. We're looking for tech leads. It's a job where you can be part of a startup that's disrupting education, providing NZ.js certifications, building a platform from scratch, all sorts of cool stuff. So, if you're interested, and it's fully remote. All right. So we're not completely off the street, so this is just a flashcard of the fact that we built solutions at scale. Our mission is to find and create the developers we wanted to hire, and help people into the field because it didn't feel right. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So when we're teaching, we often try and think about what the journey will be like for the student, for the learner. And a typical tool we use, and I'm going to use that here for today's presentation, is a lesson plan. So the journey we're taking is we're going to do some reflection as to why it's actually important or why it's useful to be able to have this skill called teaching. We're going to look at that skill called teaching and look at some of the concepts, some tools, give you tips and tricks that you can use in your environments, in your organizations, maybe with individuals you want to help on their own journeys. And then we're going to practice some teaching. So you're going to take those skills and apply them. So hopefully, along with your neighbor, I'm hoping most of you have neighbors, you'll be able to practice some of this and teach a technical concept. Yeah. And finally, we'll review what we've learned.
Cool. So the other thing we're going to do is actually take you behind the scenes as we go through this. So we're going to use a concept from a book called Teaching from the Back of the Room. It's called the 4 C's. It looks something like this. So first C is connections. We're going to take you through the problem, and we're going to connect that to the real world. So set context. We're going to use things like metaphors, analogy, give you everything you need to understand why we're saying the stuff we are. The next thing is the concepts. So then we're just going to dive into actually what we're trying to teach. After that, we follow with concrete practice, and that is actually doing something, so applying the knowledge from the concepts. And finally, we go into conclusions, which is really important. It's the point that you reflect on what you've learned through the concepts. A lot of people miss this, but you should do it. It's kind of important to reinforce what you learned through concepts. Oh, sorry. So we're going to do a bit of audience engagement. Sorry for you, but it's what's going to happen. So if you wouldn't mind opening up your phones, go into this address and answering that question now. So if you could teach a junior developer one thing, what would it be?
Control tab. Hoping it's working.
Yeah, me too. Oh, sorry, at the very top there as well.
That top line, there's a URL and a code. Yep, documentation. I was with the class probably an hour before this session, and one thing I said to them is, I'm giving you a kata to do, and I've included URLs of documentation. So it was the join operator, the split operator, and I was like, I never liked the initial acronym for read the man page, but reading documentation and error message is a huge part of that. So we've got lots of stuff coming up. Communication, how to ask for help, how to ask good questions, problem solving, how to be fearless. This is great stuff. Learn best practices, empathy, huge. Time management, yep, that's one we try and foster. I was talking about that today with students. Keeping it simple. Yeah, you don't need to overcomplicate the solution. Documentation, don't be afraid. You learn through doing. Learning, debugging, huge. Like when I've shown students how to use a debugger, it's like their eyes open. They're like, this is really, super skill. I don't need to console log.
I still console log.
Yeah. Setting milestones. All right, so the reason we did this is to connect with is to connect with Raf hit stuff. This is what happens. Yes, there we go. All right, is to enforce those connections. Right. I want all of you to reflect on the fact that if we are going to teach, or we're going to take juniors on that journey, we have an idea across all of us as to what we'd like to see in those juniors, right? The skills we'd like to build in them. We have an idea of what sort of knowledge we could impart, what we could turn those learning programs into. And at the same time, we're doing the connections thing, right? You're making this personal. A big part of connections is it's becoming part of your journey. The learner is finding relevancy in it. They're thinking about it. They're engaging. They're becoming, one with the material. And this isn't just, for us to feel good about ourselves. We can feel good about ourselves if we want to, but there's a problem, globally, right? We all are aware this isn't new stuff, but there is a market. We're going into what we call the fourth industrial revolution. There's going to be more and more need for developers. The demand for developers is growing and growing. And if you look at New Zealand, there is a skills shortage. I am here because of skills shortage. And we're still graduating people out of traditional universities. They're coming out. And if you look at MB, they're saying that's still not enough to meet the demand. So people like me, you can see those big black bars on the left. We were coming in, to try and meet a need. People are like, hey, we need this, this, and this, pre-made. Let's go tick it off. And then, there was a big influx. And then something weird happened in 2020, COVID. And suddenly there's a dip there. And there are New Zealanders coming back, yeah? There are people coming back to New Zealand. And the question is, how do we build that capacity here at home? Yeah, what's the long-term solution instead of the short-term, let's just hit it with a hammer? It's no secret there's an issue around fair diversity in tech, around our industry representing what's going on in industry, representing society, yeah, and the population at large. Either culturally or through gender. So there are people out there, and daily, Lance and I, our sort of job is to take people who would like to enter our industry, who've not had the opportunity at the offset. So I heard, there are people from Inspiral here going on similar journeys. There's so many people who want to enter our field. Yet, when I was hiring, I will put my hand up, I was bad. Yeah, I don't know, bad is the right word, but there was a short-term need, and that wasn't, from Raf. That was institutional, that was the investment of, what it takes to grow people. Go on, Lance.
That's your slide too.
This is me as well.
Come on, man, you got it. You can do it.
So teaching, sometimes you have to ad-lib because you miss stuff. Essentially, though, this is building those connections, right? This is personal to me, and I'm hoping that's coming out. But I'm hoping that there are also people here who are going to feel the same, right? That there are people who are trying to get their break in and who are not able to. There are people who would like to bring in new people and grow them and become better developers through educating others. And perhaps that's not where the budget's going.
Nicely said. Cool, so I'm going to do a bit of a thought experiment now. And what I want you to do is put your hand up if your company's hiring developers at the moment. And then keep your hand up if they're hiring junior developers. It's quite a big difference. So just a bit of reflection, think about in your company, how many of your recent hires have actually been junior developers? And then carrying on that thought process, what's the minimum bar for a junior that you would expect? What's the kind of skills that they should have? And then the next question is, who's teaching them those skills? Is it universities or tertiary institutions, or do you expect them to teach them themselves? Definitely something to think about. Whose responsibility is it to teach these people?
So think about that for a second, whose responsibility it is. Being able to teach, is part of the repertoire of a good developer, a good senior developer. It's not just about cutting code. You're building solutions for real people in the world. You're working in teams, and you want to be able to work efficiently with the team. We talk about the high-performing team, but that doesn't come from thin air. It comes from collaboration. It comes from being able to help others on that journey. There is a thing called the Agile Coaching Competency Framework. There are many frameworks out there, but this is one actually that helped me feel okay with getting into teaching a few years ago. I was going through life stuff, looking for meaning, right? I'd had a bereavement and some stuff. And I'd kind of been in the space where I'd been engineering, I'd been architecting, I'd been tech leading, and I kind of deluded myself that I could teach. But I wanted to make a difference. And an opportunity came up with a French company, and I was like, do I do this or not? Is it still aligned with what I want to do in my life? And I thought about, what would make me a better tech lead, or a better, senior developer, a better person able to help others on that journey. And the coaching competency framework kind of brings out what it takes to help a team, right? You're definitely going to have some strong skill in your domain. Yeah, if that's front-end development, it's something that you are savvy with, right? You may be an awesome React developer if you're working with a React team. You may be awesome at back-end services or DevOps or containerization or whatever it is your team needs. You may be good with agile coaching if that's what you need. So this covers a whole scope of things, but you need a discipline you're good at. Then there's the other part of it. You're working with individuals, so there's mentoring. There's one-to-ones. There's taking others through their journey. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, has anyone had the situation where you were in a team where you just weren't getting the support from your seniors, from the people who are helping you progress? Because I've been there. I had to go through learning by myself, not always getting the support from others, and I guess the world's changed a bit. But good mentors are hard to come by, and that's a skill you need. That's a skill in itself. Facilitation, helping people align on what we're trying to build, right? On the outcome that you're trying to achieve as a team, getting people to move away from disputes over design. That is, part of what makes a good leader. And on the top left there, you've got teaching, right? It's a skill in itself. Me running a workshop as a tech lead didn't make me a good teacher. So I went through this journey of actually, there is this set of skills that we underplay, and how can I learn them better? And, that's how I came to be here today. But I think the point to make here is that teaching, or that skill set, can potentially make you better. So, embrace it. There are no golden bullets, as to how you embrace it, but it's a journey.
Cool. It's another little thought exercise we're going to do. If you were to build a robot teacher, what capabilities would you prioritize? So take a moment to look at the scale up there and just think through it. What do you think makes a good teacher?
So we've got adaptability, we have planning, we have communication. These aren't necessarily technical skills. Patience and expertise. This is similar to the framework.
Yep. Cool. And then next thing I want you to do is have a think about if you yourself possess any of those capabilities.
So behind the scenes, we're introducing concepts again. So these are new things. We moved from trying to connect it with you to showing you some frameworks, some models, trying to introduce the fact that actually teaching is something broader than a letterhead, right? There are things and attributes that you require to be a teacher, that there's more depth. And we're going to continue exploring some concepts. So we're going to talk about learning and synchronous learning. So synchronous, keyword, we as developers know, right? It's sequential, real-time interaction. You and I talking together now. You know, you responding to me talking back to you responding to me responding to you. Be intentional about how you structure your learning activities. So synchronous learning, there are many ways of engaging with those juniors you're working with, right? And if you're aware of how you're using these tools, you can get better outcomes. So live workshops, you know, be intentional that this particular learning engagement needs you and individuals in a room to be able to share back and forth, right? That is the right tool. That you may need to do, you know, practical activities. It can be remote, it can be on site, remote, or it can be like face-to-face. The one-on-ones with individuals are key as well. You know, maybe you need to sit down with someone, pair with them. I've used mob programming a lot. I'm a big fan of mob programming. You know, getting people together. I call it like demystifying. I had a bunch of people doing Scala a few years ago, and like it was a data science company, and people were terrified of like, you know, the data science bit of it. So I got a bunch of developers, some JavaScript developers, a UXer, some Java developers, people who weren't doing the data science bit, to sit in a room and build a transformer. Yeah, take some data, manipulate it, and do something else. It's fairly simple in that sort of space. And taking them through the journey of swapping on the keyboard, having a go, writing, looking at the documentation made it real, right? It made it less, this is magic the data science person has, to this is code we can write. You know, the metaphors, the similarities between languages. But sometimes you need to do those sorts of activities to get the outcome you're after. As I said, mentoring is another one. You can also be intentional about asynchronous learning. So I use asynchronous a lot in the remote context. Asynchronous learning is where people sometimes just need to take their own time to achieve an outcome. Yeah, they need to absorb the material, right? When I am learning something in depth, it's not going to help me to sit, you know, as a student, it never helped me to sit and watch a lecture. I would need to go off. They say you read a degree.
Cool. Another concept I want to talk about is flipped classrooms. So maybe many of you have a similar experience to me. Sorry. Said we got 10 minutes, but we've got an hour talking. We're like, what? All good. Sorry. So yeah, flipped classrooms. Maybe many of you have a similar experience to me at school, where you rocked up to a class and sat there for an hour and someone talked at you. And then they gave you homework and you went home and you did your homework after school and you were like, Mum and Dad, can you please help me? And they were like, I don't know high school maths, so you got no help. It's actually a silly model if you think about it. So gaining a lot of traction in the education sector now is the idea of flipped classrooms. Literally just changes that model around. So whereas the traditional model is synchronous content delivery, or like synchronous, you know, you get the content, and then async, you do the activity. Flipped classroom is the opposite. Asynchronously, you do the content. Synchronously, you do the activity. And this is immense for people's learning. You know, if you're reading content before you come to class, the class now is all about engagement and reinforcing ideas. So, you know, talking about the things you read, doing activities, you know, peer programming, doing quizzes, having fun, pretty much. Yeah, good concept.
Yeah, we use flipped classrooms like a lot. It's major in the way we teach. When COVID first hit, I was in a place where we were doing training. It was, and I started making notes about, you know, how training was effective, you know, what types of training was effective. And what I found was the in-classroom synchronous situation didn't really work. Slacks, you know, another way of doing async, were great. Let students like get together, collaborate, you know, come to you with questions. You suddenly turn what would have been a 1 hour class into a bigger window. So the tools are there. We use them as devs daily. Use them with the people who you're intentionally trying to grow. So the other thing is planning your learning scenarios. As I said, it's a key thing to be able to go into a scenario having thought about how you're going to deliver it. Now, the sorts of tools we try and use when we're doing this, you know, in the connect phase, is to ground things in real terms that people can kind of understand, right? Because you come in, you don't know the material. There's no point hitting you with all the details of the material yet. You need to be eased in. But what do you bring with you, right? You bring past experience. You bring the real world. When I'm working with people who are non-technical, initially, their real-world experiences aren't even technical metaphors. There's a thing called professional bias. I used to get told off a lot by a mentor with the French place I worked in, because she was like, you're in the industry, you're expecting people to know what things are, You talk about a pool. A pool doesn't mean what you think it means to the other person. It's what you swim in. So, just even watch your language. But what came out of that, to take the pool example, is the idea of using metaphors. So I was teaching a concurrency class, and I talked about, this was a different language, but pool of threads. And I used a metaphor of a swimming pool. Yeah, it was a bit far-fetched. I talked about, being able to grow the building, construct an extension on it. And I talked about the number of swimmers in a lane. But if you can relate things to real-world activities, you can teach, people the basic concepts. Yeah. So metaphors are huge. I love metaphors. I'm awful at metaphors sometimes. But if you can take the time to plan the metaphor before you come in, it's win. The next thing is around delivery of the concepts. Having decks ready, right? Having content that you're going to put out in front of people, and preparing that, minimal is always good. There's a separation, there's a difference between decks and worksheets, right? Handouts. And this is something that someone else taught me long, long ago, because sometimes you get the handout given to you, which is like the slideshow, and the worksheet. They're different. Make them different. Create intentional learning content if you can. If you've got Confluence or Wiki or whatever it is you're using, create something which is the absorbable content in written form. And when you're doing the session with people, minimize it. And then they can learn, and they can do the deep learning asynchronously again. Plan the delivery. Plan how you're going to run the workshop. The other thing, as was said, is concrete practice. So we're reiterating, we're reinforcing here. We'll talk about that in a bit later. But make sure the activities are kind of relevant, that they bring people in to the journey, that they connect with the concepts you've just introduced, that people get to personalize it, and make sure they're inclusive. It's so easy to run a workshop where there are 3 people who kind of get it, and then the rest of the class, for lack of, presence, lack of confidence, lack of, we've had students who don't want to ask the question, get excluded. So try and bring people in as much as possible, include them, ask the questions, make the material async if you need to. I've done silent retros in the past, slow retros, I think we call them, where people contribute their learnings over a longer period of time, digitally. And then you can get together to do the last step, which is the conclusions. Right? Reinforcing what you've just learned, making sure that there's some sort of follow-through to it, that people know how they're going to use this material. It's noddy stuff, but it's noddy stuff that you need to enforce yourself as you're going through the journey.
Cool. So another thought exercise. I love these things. Now you know about the 4 C's, so I actually forget them, which is funny. Connection, bring the real world into it. Concepts, what are you actually teaching? Concrete practice, do the thing. And finally, recap with a conclusion. We'll just spend a minute now, just take some time to think about a recent experience you had where you had to teach someone something. It can be small, you don't have to think big. And maybe refashion it a little bit using this model to see how you might have done a better job. So we'll do some awkward silence for a little bit.
Uncomfortable silences are actually quite valuable once you get comfortable with them. We're railroading through material. Absorb it and reflect.
I never know what's enough time. We'll say that's enough, maybe. Hopefully you got something though, So bring it into your day-to-day, this concept. You can do it on a micro scale. It doesn't have to be huge.
There have been times when I have, gone back at previous scenarios and tried to apply the same. So, Lance and I were talking about a recent example well, not recent, some time ago, actually not recent example, but an example where a junior who was a designer who'd come into like front-end dev, was front-end and some server-side dev, we were using some Node services, kind of was trying to get the metaphor of doing code outside of the browser, yeah? And I, being silly senior dev, started talking to him about, his Node process running within a runtime, running within an operating system, being a process, and that his process running in there, having access to system calls, having access to memory, to I/O, and I went down the wrong rabbit hole there, and I felt really good about it until I realized this guy was like probably in a worse place than where he started. And so, if you can fit in a double loop in, some of these activities, it helps. I write a little diary, like a daily double loop diary, to see some of the bigger events that have happened that day, things that I could have done better. And, that's self-teaching. It's quite key. But apply those concepts, because they give you some structure.
Cool. Leads beautifully into the next slide, which is teach the bare minimum. It's similar to software dev, like do the least amount of work you can, but teach the bare minimum. So, as Raf talked about before, there's a thing called professional bias. And actually, as a senior dev, you can view the world through your job. And when you're telling a junior a concept, you kind of think that they need to know everything you need to know. And you just say all the things you know. And they're like, what the heck did you just say? I have no idea. And it actually makes them, not feel so smart, because they're like, I didn't get any of that. An example, something I did around this, I was trying to teach conditionals to a bunch of learners, and, I taught if statements and switch statements. And then, if you think about it, switch statements don't really add anything extra to if statements in the concept of conditionals. So all they ended up doing was people being like, I have to learn two things, and then asking more questions like, well, why would I use a switch instead of an if? So long story short, just think about what you're trying to teach, the concept, and then think about what you're going to say to that person and remove the stuff that doesn't add any value. And the other thing is, all those things you think they need to know, they will get there. And there's much more time ahead to reteach those concepts that you think they need. So to start small, build up over time.
You're actually letting them down by teaching them too much, right? There's, the curve. There's only so much they can retain.
Yep.
This concept of the curve of forgetting is essentially telling us that in, 2 days, 3 days, you'll barely remember what we said, yeah? By tomorrow, you'll remember about 60% of what we said. In a few days, you will understand a lot less, remember a lot less. And the key to this is reinforcement, right? The counterbalance to this is reinforcement. Being able to reinforce the concepts is really key. And reinforcing many concepts is very hard. There are only so many, I didn't actually find the stat for this, but there are only so many things that you can hold in your head at one time. Years ago when I did another talk, someone was like talking about how many concepts you could hold in your head. And it's low, right? So that's why you give people that asynchronous space to go into more depth. My learning coach, when I got into teaching, used to say to me, Raf, what is the minimum thing that your student needs to know? Right? Enough to start going on that journey and learning and learning and learning. Right? They don't need to know it all. Right? You're not going to know it all. They'll not learn anything if you teach them too much. So, Einstein, nice fuzzy head guy, did many great things, and he has got a quote that gets recited a lot in the space of teaching and education, which is, if you can't explain the concept to a young kid, then you probably don't understand it yourself. I used to get really wound up about this one with my teaching coach as well. When I got into teaching, I'm like, but it's a hard concept. There is so much depth to it. And when you start going down that journey of like pulling back and trying to explain it to a 6-year-old, you do realize sometimes you're making assumptions. You don't get it. You're saying to a student that there is a thing called the DOM, And then they ask you a question, what does that mean? How is it implemented? Who wrote the, I don't know, they will ask questions that you don't expect. So you start looking up more and more. When I was teaching the multi-threading thing, I probably learned more than I did as a developer, because suddenly I was like, actually, I just know a library call or two and roughly how it works. I'm not going to be able to understand this. I need to understand it better. So, being able to explain it to someone is great. Also for the student, right? Not just for the teacher, for the learner. We talked about reinforcing that concept, that feedback loop. Yeah? Being able to explain back to people is massive. When I'm in a class, I will sometimes pick people out. It's mean. And sometimes I feel mean because people are like, don't pick me. But what I get is people either saying, that they get it through explanation, or saying, actually, I didn't quite get it. Sometimes they say they get it and they stop there, and you're like, actually, you didn't, did you? And then we can have a conversation later. But that feedback loop is really good because they are reinforcing the concept. People are hearing someone else, one of their peers, repeat it. We put, resources out after a class. You recap in another class, but reinforce as much as possible. And if you can, make the elaboration happen. Make people talk about it. Make people who you are sharing knowledge with repeat back and discuss. And we call this elaboration.
Another really powerful concept in teaching is the concept of interleaving. So imagine if you were trying to teach someone the full stack, right? That's a huge concept. And say that you've broken it up into tiny little concepts. There might be a couple of different ways that you actually teach this. One approach might be that you teach front end in one block from start to finish, and then you teach the back end in the other block from start to finish, and at the end they're full stack. The concept of interleaving actually says that you shouldn't do that. What you should do is teach a tiny concept from front end, and then a tiny concept from back end, and then go back to teach the tiny concept from front end again, and then back to the back end, and then back to the front end, so on and so forth. And by doing that, you're actually allowing the students to learn one concept, and then they have a space. They have a break between the next time they learn it, and that space actually works wonders with your brain. It's really important to have space between learning. So learn a little bit, learn something else, come back to that, and then you get your reinforcement. All those connections in your brain are buzzing out. Your brain loves this technique. It's actually one of the most studied learning techniques, and well proven. So think about that as well. When you're teaching a large concept or a large thing, break it up into bits, interleave it, and space them out, and you'll have amazing results.
It comes from baseball, you were saying.
There's one study they did with baseball players trying to learn how to hit a curveball. So they did one where they just threw nothing but curveballs at the baseball players, and one where they sometimes threw curveballs. The one who sometimes got curveballs found it much harder, but they got much more talented. They learned better.
So this is a controversial one, because I hear from developers from time to time, you need to be a specialist in X. And maybe that's the end of the journey. But on the journey towards becoming the specialist in X, being a generalist can actually serve you really well. It can make you a better all-rounded developer. I've had that conversation loads, and I would say, don't shy away from being broad. We call it T-shaped development, being T-shaped, pie-shaped, cone-shaped, having strong, solid areas where you're probably interested and you're building a skill, and then still being kind of general across what it means to be a developer. When we're a full-stack developer on an agile team, generally, you may be wearing multiple hats. You're not going to, pass it off to a tester. You may be you'll hopefully be writing your own tests and collaborating with the tester as a coach. Interleaving, I've seen it in teams, I've seen it in students, can make a huge difference. My dad was a teacher in Uganda many, many years ago, and I got this one from him. He used to teach, like a local village school, kids of different ages, young kids, older kids, and some of the students he taught have become like doctors and other stuff, and they come back to my dad and they're really grateful. And my dad's an accountant, so he's by no means a natural teacher, but for a long time he was a teacher there. And he did this practice where he got people to co-teach. He'd get students who were good at one thing to teach someone else in their class. He'd introduce a concept, and people would co-teach across each other. And this made them better at doing what they do. So if you're working with your juniors or you're working within your teams, you don't need to be the only teacher there. You can introduce a concept and allow it, seeding it. Allow the people in your team, your class, your audience to co-teach one another. Yeah, they bring other expertise in, right? You're not the God. I'm not the God of what am I doing now? Server-side, by no means. But I have a class of learners who bring lots of experience in, and I can guide them on a journey, and they will take their own perspective, find their own perspective of what a thing means, a concept means. They'll co-teach. So he used to say, each one teach one. It's like Swahili English or something from my dad's day, but I loved it. And I do that in classes intentionally. Okay, so we're going to do a little exercise. When you're teaching, as I said, we teach the bare minimum, right? We introduce a concept as minimally as possible, and people can go off and explore later. Surprise for those who don't know, but doing mathematics with decimals on a computer that has binary representations doesn't always produce the right answer. So the thing to watch out for, as the minimal you need to know, is watch out for it. Yeah, you can try and scale things and make them decimal and then divide them down again, but there is a bigger problem. Now, I'm not going to go into that problem because I probably will explain it wrong, and the journey there involves a lot more than one concept. But the minimal concept I'm going to introduce is watch out for this. And there's an exercise. We're going to do some concrete. So bring up your devices, visit this URL, which is not dodgy by any means, and see if you can get this app to produce the right answer. We'd like you to work with the person who's next to you, if you can, and discuss your solution. So take some time. I'm going to give you about 4 minutes. Yeah. I'll see if people want a bit more. I'm hoping it works. There's a console window. We got feedback. We did some user testing, and someone said that there was a console window which pops up on mobile devices. You might want to close the console window. And there's a JavaScript tab with the code in it. And feel free to critique the code between you. Yeah? Don't omit the talk to your neighbor bit.
Stop at 8. Stop at 28. I hope the code pen works.
Should we bring it on screen? Do you want to? Actually, leave it there because I've got the URL. So the box at the bottom is the result of adding two numbers which look fairly innocent, I think.
We don't have much after this.
We'll do Q&A.
We can just probably let this sit for a bit. It's getting loud, we should just let it sit.
So, I'm just going to ask if anyone has any questions while you're going. So if anyone's like brutally stuck, that's another thing to like throw into the class. Oh yeah, go on. You have to speak up a bit, sorry. I know where you're heading with this. You're free to do that, totally. Yeah. Let's go with those two specific numbers. The creative student. That was Tom's question, wasn't it? That was Tom's question, I think.
What's that, sorry? Oh, I can't hear you. Sorry. It's really loud.
How's it going? Did you get it? Cool. Let's see. God, I'm aging. My eyes are like completely gone. Ah, yes, that's a good way of doing it. Yep, scaling it up.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sounds like it's getting a bit quiet, so we're going to go behind the scenes quickly again. What we just did there was the concrete practice. So we introduced you to the concept of each one, teach one. And what might have happened with some groups is maybe you had one person who knew the answer and maybe one person who didn't. And likely what happened in that scenario is the person who knew the answer taught the person who didn't know the answer. And probably also what happened is the person who taught reinforced those concepts even further, and the person who didn't know got to learn. What's the other common saying? When one teaches, two learn. So, yeah, that was an example of putting into concrete practice a concept.
I'm curious to know what some of the solutions you came up with were. Does anyone want to kind of like volunteer what they did? Because there's several ways, obviously, to skin the cat. Yep.
I limited the decimal places using two fixed.
Okay, wonderful. Yep. Anyone else? Oh, so my friend Laura here did a common solution, which is, she scaled it up by 10, right? She multiplied by 10, divided by 10. There was BigInt introduced recently to be able to store, sort of like large precision integers. Just converting it to 10 means you're storing it in a default integer representation, which is going to be smaller than the floating point representation. So being able to use something like BigInt means that you will maintain precision. Anyone else? So, what you can do is you do the concrete practice, do some evaluation, talk about, the solutions in the group. Look at the different solutions people came up with. I've seen, people mess this up on, presenting like financial reports, and you don't want to do that because this isn't JavaScript. This is JavaScript. It's C. It's Java. It's the floating point standard.
Cool, so moving on to more concepts. This one is about problem-based learning. So really important when you're doing your activities or, the concrete part is you put things into real-world scenarios. So that's what problem-based learning is about. Ideally, you want to present a real problem. You don't want to make an artificial problem. I mean, you can fake it, but you make it authentic. And make it realistic. So get your learners to plan this solution, get them to build it, and once they've built it, get them to evaluate the results. So in practice, this might look like something like, a Jira bug report, that you present to your learner and they have to then fix it. That's an authentic thing that might happen in the workplace. Even if you contrive it, it's still an authentic learning experience, and that's what problem-based learning is. So if you can ditch the foobar, that means nothing to anyone, and actually put real-world concepts in front of people, then they're going to respond much better.
You're doing that in the classroom as well, in the workplace as well, right? So a bug, a user story. This is the same process we go through when we're working on something, right? You have a problem definition, a user story. or a bug report. Yeah, someone's saying like, hey, I've got a video here. The video demonstrates that I click here and it doesn't work. So what happens? You do analysis. All right? You figure out, how am I going to approach this? You may check out log files. You may debug it. But you're going to have some approach that you're going to apply. And then you do it, right? You fix it. You fix it. Now, sometimes people just like push it out, but there is opportunity to stop and learn. Of stuff we used to do, fail cake. It stood for all I've learned, which kind of ties in with this, but we had real problems like production incidents, right? Production incidents could be a telling off, it could be an emergency fix you forget, right? It was a reason to have a 5 whys, to ask why, and understand and learn from a situation. And we had cake with it as well. Fail stood for all I learned. So, flip those negative situations into positive ones, and that will create a culture of learning. And it'll turn a thing you do, a real-world problem that people are attached to, into something that they can learn from, right? Because the nuances are firing there. It's like a real issue. I get stressed when I have production issues, or I used to. Still do. I don't want any more production issues. It's one of the joys of teaching right now, until we scale to production issues. All right.
Cool. So when you are running your activities, you want them to be engaging and fun. And the best way to do that is actually to have fun yourself. So be creative, be energetic, like actually just have fun with whoever you're teaching. It's pretty fun when you do that. Other thing is gamifying. Like people love gamifying stuff. When I'm teaching, we have this tool we use called Kahoot, which is like a competitive quiz. And I put that in front of my students, and it's like crack. They just love it. At the very end, it's like you get a podium with the winner and stuff. Such good fun. Encouraging collaboration as well. So I think we've talked about this a lot, but I just can't overstate how effective a technique collaboration is. So each one, teach one, all that stuff is super, super powerful. And finally take breaks. So your brain can only handle so much. So maybe after an hour, take a 10-minute break, especially with remote working now. You get Zoom fatigue or whatever it's called. Yeah, super important to chill out a little bit as well. It's quite intense learning.
It is. I mean, if you go straight class to class, you've all been there. You'll be like, happens at conferences as well.
Just a good one.
Did I? Oh yes. So group programming. As I said, I love mod programming with teams, mod programming with students. It's called ensemble programming, pair programming if you scale it down to 2. But it's people solving a problem together, right? And they're learning together. I've seen teams go from feeling completely, kind of like, oh, I'm the expert at this, I'm the expert at this, to becoming like brothers. And I think we've repaired, haven't we? So we used to work together at Stuff, and now we work together at Developers Institute. So we clearly built a bond. And use this. There are many patterns for this. You can look out there. I did a thing on this at the last nz.js on patterns for mod programming and pair programming, and there are many out there. So check that out. Use it. It's a great way. Sometimes organizations think they're inefficient ways of like using staff, but the learnings you get out of them is massive. We have an exercise. Should we do that? I think we have time.
Yep.
So metaphors. Metaphors are really powerful ways of getting a concept across. They're hard to come up with. Take a minute or so and have a think about a metaphor you'd use, a real-world metaphor, to someone non-technical, about to describe what an API is. It's a real one we do with students as well.
Your Kahoot is like crack, went down quite well.
Yeah, you do.
Should we skip
yeah,
it? Skip it.
yeah. Do you want to call it? Okay. I hate to break it, but to keep time, which is really hard in a class scenario as well, you need to keep things moving. So to keep time, does anyone want to call out, what their metaphor was? Go on. Awesome. Do you want to repeat that one? Because that Lance came up with that as well. I thought one of your classes.
Oh, I stole it from a video on YouTube. But,
there you go.
I'll take the credit. But it is a great metaphor. So I'll repeat that back for everyone if you didn't hear it. But that was a metaphor is like a waiter in a restaurant, I think it is. So you go into a restaurant, you get your menu, you order off it. The waiter goes back to the kitchen, tells the chef who makes your meal, and the waiter brings you back the complete dish. And you don't know what happens in the kitchen. You don't really care. You just, your menu's the interface between the kitchen and not. So that's how you might explain that API.
And you can post to it as well. Like you can give them your sandwich and then put it on the menu. So we're going to skip that one. There. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of a recap here. I think these 4 concepts, if you take anything away, hopefully they've been hammered home enough that the reinforcements happened, but connections. Open with the aim of making people feel connected with the material you're about to present. Bridge the gap between the world they were in, like 5 minutes ago, in their life in general, whatever, and now. Yeah? You're connecting them to the material. If you've got a group, you're connecting them to each other as well. So warm-up activities can be a part of that as well. The go around the room, what are you doing type thing. We don't do it for fun, we do it for a reason, right? So embed that. Concepts, right? We introduced new concepts. There's no point in having a workshop unless you've shared those concepts, right? The whole point is learning. The concepts are kind of the gold, the nugget in the middle of it all. So you're trying to get the concept across. You're introducing them. But obviously telling someone something doesn't mean they're going to remember it, doesn't mean it's going to be meaningful to them. So we move on to doing the concrete practice, which is taking that concept and trying to make it really embed itself and, those synapses connecting, do some active learning, apply the concept. You're more likely to walk out with an understanding for what you've just learned if you've used that material. Not to say that you're not going to forget 60% by tomorrow or 40% by tomorrow, but next, evaluate. We're doing that now, meta. Evaluate, recap. Yeah, lots of stuff happened. Let's pull out the core points.
Yep, and get them. It's quite good I find it's quite good to get people to get them to tell you what they learned in their own words, and it makes them kind of recontextualize it in their own brain, and that's a powerful way as well to, reflect on what they've learned, but it's actually another teaching moment, which is really good.
We're not going to do that to any of you, don't worry.
Yes.
So. Okay.
I can start. So we did go over a lot of concepts as well. Talked about flipped classrooms, taking the asynchronous, synchronous nature of traditional classrooms and just totally reversing it. Using your synchronous time for activities, your asynchronous time for the material. Teach the bare minimum. So just, whatever you think you're going to teach them, just cut out 90% of that.
What does my student need to know? I have it on my whiteboard behind me.
Yep.
I've got a whiteboard at home because I'm a weird agilist person. Elaboration, all right? Repeat back. Discuss it. Try to simplify it. Articulate it, that thing about, explain it to a child. If you can't break it down into simple terms, it's probably that tier that's not going to be accessible to your learner, right? You probably don't get it. Well, maybe you do get it, but you can't take your professional bias and filter it down to something that someone else is going to be able to absorb, which means you might as well not try. I wouldn't say that, but I did say that. All right, which is why you want to simplify it as much as possible.
Yep, and interleaving, just to recap, is when you mix up concepts, space them apart, and revisit them over and over again.
And problem-based learning, what we do in the workplace, right?
Yeah, make it real.
Make it real. Real problems are going to be so much more meaningful. You can do it with contrived problems. You can make them meaningful. There are many ways of doing that. Hackathons are really great, right? I've had sessions where people go off and they're given a challenge. Go and get a COVID API and produce some sort of result from it. But the most real problems are the ones that are personal to you, right? So as I talked about, the production outage, the user story, which is difficult. We have juniors who we work with, and they may have trouble with a platform, like Google Analytics or something. And for them, that's a huge learning. So you can turn any sort of activity and engagement into, a learning in itself. Okay, so conclusion here, overarching. For you, and Lance will talk about what it means for society, but for you, I get a lot of fulfillment. I don't know, I don't want to say it, but I think it can make you a better dev, right? It forces you to understand things in another level of detail. And, you could say that you do that anyway, but when you know you're going to be in front of a class full of people, it changes the way you look at your material.
And the big picture really is that you can hire a junior and transform someone's life. So, as an industry, we're not particularly good at hiring juniors. I'm not sure if it's because we're too busy or, not enough devs, I guess, might be the problem. Really good way to solve that might be to train devs, for example. So, I think really we just need to open the doors and we need to let juniors in. And we need to help them grow. We need to take responsibility ourselves for teaching them. And literally you could transform someone's life through teaching them development. And we do that all the time, which is really amazing.
And so you're going to be able to do that. They're code clubs, right? I volunteer at code clubs. I hear people talk about Inspiral. There are places like that. There's places like Developers Institute who are hiring fully remote. Let me know if you're interested. Obviously, then we have, just those one-to-ones, asymmental people, right? There was a developer who came from Brazil. We used to sit, go to the Wellington Library when I lived in Wellington and talk about Java Spring Code. And I helped him on his journey. He's doing really well. He's working fully remote from Auckland now. And that was nice for me. It was nice for someone else. You're imparting the knowledge, and it pushes you. The hope is that you will bring on juniors. And Developers Institute are producing graduates as well. So, if you're hiring juniors, hit me up. All right. Enough seeding there, sorry.
Blatant sales pitch.
I know. Yeah. Got to do it, though.
And that's the end.
And that's the end. So any questions? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Hi, Raf. My workmate Anna told me on Friday to say hi to you, so I'm saying hi.
Who was that?
Anna.
Oh, really? Say hello to her. I haven't seen her for ages. Yeah.
And I have a question around metaphors, and I think it's something many people who are native English speakers don't understand. It's really difficult for people who are not native English speakers to understand a lot of the tech terms. Because for me, as a non-native English speaker, when I was learning all these developer concepts, I was learning them in English. And then I didn't know that some of these words actually also have another meaning in English. So I thought this is just some dev terms. And map, for me, a map is a noun. I didn't know that you can have a verb. And so having a map function didn't make any sense. And same learning about flux in React, I didn't notice like there's a word in English that's a flux, and it actually, oh, now it makes complete sense, like all that thing. So how do you go about explaining these kind of terms to people who are not native English speakers, and how do you explain these metaphors? Because for them, that's like, it's a completely different level of explaining things.
So I studied computer science in Pisa, in Italian, informatica, and it's actually quite easy because you can take the English word and stick an A at the end in some places. For me, I went through a similar thing because, as you said, you read metaphors, they don't make sense, right? And part of it, for me at least, was talking to others and like going to the professor, having a conversation about, I don't really get this. When I'm working with students, I am trying to make sure people get the metaphors, right? And part of that may be small classes, can be like huge. We sometimes have large classes, we break into smaller groups. But you need to pick, generic metaphors. As I said, if I'm talking, using a metaphor that's computer-based, it's not going to help a junior. Similarly, I need to be aware if the metaphor I'm using is grounded in an assumption of someone having spoken English previously. Now, I'll put up my hand. I'm probably not doing that. I'm not self-aware enough. But what I am aware is that when I have people in my class who I think will be struggling, I will have conversations with them. I'll try and make sure people are getting it. I don't know if Lance has a different take on that, but it's part of the teaching thing, right? You're aware of the people you're teaching to. You're trying to get feedback, elaboration.
Yeah, for me, heaps of it's like personal relationships. So, if I was teaching you, I'd probably know a bit about you, and I'd try and cater the content and the metaphor that matches the audience.
We're trying to get to know our students. It's a harder one if you're doing like fully asynchronous courses. So I've done those which are made available to people, and then other mentors and other people are available for the students to ask questions to. And they're global, right? They're all over the world. And so the thing I tried to do there is when I wrote the syllabus, or I wrote guidance for the mentor, I tried to keep it at the minimal, and I trusted that they had the professional ability to communicate, but you never know if they're going to be aware, that the metaphor that they're using is wrong. So I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for you, Laura. Sorry. And say hello to Anna. Yeah.
Hi. Just wondering if you would change anything if you were using this to teach a junior insofar as a child.
I used to code club, and I've got two kids who are uber geeks, right? All three of us use Manjaro, and my son is entering a competition today to put a Celeste level mod somewhere. But with the kids, I don't know if this is controversial. I'm a homeschooler, right? So we do something called unlearning, which is a lot more based around some of these concepts around activities, and it's more pull-based. This is my take as a homeschooler. Not, I think the adult setting is a bit different. This is suited to intentional workshops, intentional engagements, intentional material. There's another pace. I started learning to code as a 9-year-old, right, on a computer called Sword M5. It was based on a love for the fact I had, I could do stuff, right? I could plot a little monster going across the screen. The first game I wrote was a black canvas, and if you hit like not canvases in JavaScript space, but a black, a minimal resolution screen, and if you happen to move a character to a given location, he blew up, but you couldn't see anything else. But there was a love for it, and so my kids have kind of learned through that love, right? They get the support. We've used things like Learn to Code and some of the other things, but they don't enjoy that as much as when they were doing Minecraft. They did Minecraft modding, right? And they learned some Java. And my son decompiled bits of Celeste, right? Because he was curious. And so I think my answer to that would be, if you can, be a lot more creative with the students. Code Club is great, right? Code Club has syllabuses. It's very much like this. And you put them in front of people. My kids didn't enjoy that as much because they wanted to do their own thing. And I think there's kind of like a halfway house between the two, right? The schooling system has a metaphor around it, and it can work in that context. But as someone who went through that journey, someone who's a dad, let people be creative. And that can apply to the workspace as well, right? You can do personal projects. I say to my students, right, you want to build a portfolio, do a personal project you care about, right? It's much better than an exercise. But there is something about the love for the discipline which I think can be a bigger driver for learning. Do you have thoughts on that one, Lance?
No, very little experience with children.
What was that? Any other questions? Is that a question? Yep, go on.
Hey, I really enjoyed your talk. So you talked about interweaving different actual ideas together, but what about like interleaving different messages of the same idea? So reteaching it in a different manner. Is that something you do as well?
Yeah, I guess we do that. So yeah, a lot of repetition. And I guess the thing with interleaving is you also need that space between ideas. So spacing is actually quite important. So you do want to have a bit of a break where you do something else and then come back to it. But always build up, so what we do is if we introduce a concept, we'll do something else, then we come back. And maybe it's a slightly different concept this time, but building on that one before. So you kind of intentionally make it more complex, but every time you're still revisiting that concept over and over. Yeah.
You just triggered some synapses here as well, because like today, in today's class, I gave an anagram kata to a bunch of students. And what I said to them is, because you always have people who run ahead sometimes, right? Cater for the different abilities. I was like, if you run ahead and you can get it done, try and do it a different way, right? And I'm not trying to get people to think about complexity yet, because it's not the thing they need to learn, right? But I was trying to seed that, and I was like, come back to it and think about, how many times you have to loop through your data, think about what the operators are doing, see if you can do it in a simpler way. And I didn't even realize I was interleaving there. So, that's a good point. Kata's doing them again in different ways, I think, is an example of, where I've done that.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Awesome. Can we get another round of applause for Raf and Lance? So